It's either the courts have the power to make decisions or not. And why the hell in the first place do we have them if they can't make decisions? The people on the other side who are beneficiaries of that will use it as a wild card. How would you respond to that?
Our elected officials, a number of them, have been really keen to kind of outsource or subcontract out these divisive issues to the courts because the politicians can kind of just say, well, like the judges made us do this. I don't like the decision that the court has come to, but like, what are we going to do? It's what the Constitution requires. And there's even instances where not only does this has kind of been used strategically of if there's a particularly a controversial issue that a prime minister or a premier of a province can say, well, we're actually going to ask the courts to weigh in on this and let's let them tell us what they think, what the Constitution requires. And that allows the politician or the leader of a party or a prime minister to kind of quell internal dissent, maybe from his own members who feel strongly one way. And so you're kind of, well, let's just sort of, instead of us debating this and, being at each other's throats, we'll just allow this other institution to weigh in on it. Let's see what they have to say. And that's a way of sort of kind of depoliticizing the issue. But that doesn't mean that the issue is still not important, or it's not still kind of political. It just means that you're kind of asking another institution to do it for you. And so the elected officials have been, in many cases, kind of complicit in facilitating this process.
It's a better alternative to just use the ramp to get to the same destination by elected officials, if the loophole is there, right?
There's a lot of different things going on with this. And I talk to my students about some of these issues about that. Some of these controversial issues, if you only kind of read them like kind of on the headline of like a news story or something, they often seem more straightforward than they actually are. And, politicians, elected officials are very responsive to, the media or kind of short-term decision making and are very, want to avoid, negative stories about like what they're doing and these sorts of things. Let me see. So I guess like a good example of politicians doing what I just described was how Canada came to adopt same-sex marriage. So this was back in 2005 that Canada broadened the definition of marriage from the traditional definition of a man and a woman to the exclusion of all others. That was the original legal definition. And then in 2005, Canada passed a law defining marriage as, a union between two individuals. So no longer having any kind of designation in the definition of marriage. And so at the time, this is now 20 years ago, the same-sex marriage issue was actually quite divisive in Canada. And not even just divisive in the sense of like liberals versus conservatives. So we had a liberal government at the time. And the issue was actually quite divisive, like within the Liberal Party itself. Again, some of this is like kind of ancient history, but in Canada, Catholics tend to vote Liberal more often, not always, but there's a strong relationship between Catholic voters and the Liberal Party. And there's lots of social science research to back that up. And so the Liberal government at the time, this issue was very divisive within the Liberal caucus itself. And you had a lot of people within the Liberal Party wanting to retain the traditional definition of marriage. And you had people in the Conservative Party who also felt that way as well. But then you also had people within the same party, within the Liberal Party, who thought that Canada should broaden the definition of marriage to include same-sex couples. And so Canada's constitution has this mechanism called the reference power. And so a prime minister can ask the Supreme Court of Canada a hypothetical question about a legal question, and the court can weigh in on that hypothetical. And so the government of the day asked the court, would it be consistent with the charter to extend the definition of marriage to same-sex couples? And so there were four specific questions that were asked in this legal process, but the Supreme Court of Canada issued its opinion in this case, and the court was actually very kind of coy in its answer and said, adding the definition of marriage to include same-sex couples isn't required by the Constitution, but it wouldn't be unconstitutional. So the court didn't actually come out and say the charter requires this. But the way in which the government chose to interpret the court's opinion was to present it as if it had to do this and as if to say, we've asked the court what it thinks about this issue. And the court has said that the same-sex definition of marriage would be consistent with the charter. And so, the Liberal Party is going to put forward a bill in the Parliament of Canada to make that change. And so that's an example of how if you didn't have a charter and the courts had no final say, you could have just had a parliamentary process to hash that out. But it was convenient for the government of the day and for the Liberal Party to have this other institution that it could kind of lean on and kind of subcontract out the difficult question to, and make the question seem like it was a technical legal issue, rather than just one that was part of politics. And so, so that issue is not controversial anymore because the definition has been changed for these past 20 years. But at the time, this was like front page news. It was covered for a long time. And it was a very big deal.
Interesting. That sounds like the court has become a wild card. So you can just pull it off and use it to win the game when it's convenient. Let me add to that. Your critics will say it's either the courts have the power to make decisions or not. And why the hell in the first place do we have them if they can't make decisions? The people on the other side who are beneficiaries of that will use it as a wild card. How would you respond to that?
I think that the courts and the Supreme Court especially, like I said, the powers that it has, some of it, not all of it, but some of it is the product of, a democratic and political process. There's a Supreme Court justice who's now deceased, named Bertha Wilson. She was the first woman ever appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada. And she wrote an article once called "We Didn't Volunteer." And the title being as in, the democracy chose to add a charter and now we're just doing our job as required under the Constitution. So we didn't choose this. We didn't volunteer to become the institution with the final say. And so I appreciate that and take that point. But there are lots of other things that the court has done where it has been more kind of adventurous or creative and has really stretched the meaning of the text of the Constitution in ways that I think would make the people who drafted the charter would be very surprised in kind of where we've ended up. So yeah, it's, and I don't think that the role of the courts is going to change anytime soon necessarily. And I imagine that the court is going to keep making lots of headlines for lots of time going forward too.